My name is Rachel, and when my 6-year-old daughter was lying in a hospital bed waiting for emergency surgery, not a single member of my family showed up. 2 months later, those same people appeared at my door demanding $15,000, and when I refused, they called my bank trying to freeze my accounts. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who share your blood care less about you than strangers ever could, and how I built a life that proved them wrong in every possible way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Morrison and I am 31 years old now, but this story really begins much earlier, in the suburban Connecticut town where I grew up as the younger of 2 children in what appeared from the outside to be a comfortable, successful family. My father, Douglas Morrison, was a corporate financial advisor who managed investment portfolios for wealthy clients. My mother, Carolyn Morrison, was a real estate broker who specialized in luxury properties. My older brother, Trevor, was 5 years my senior, and from my earliest memories occupied a position of absolute favoritism in our family structure. The dynamics of our household were established long before I was old enough to understand or question them. Trevor was the golden child, the one in whom my parents invested their hopes, their resources, and their attention. When Trevor expressed interest in playing lacrosse in middle school, my parents purchased thousands of dollars in equipment and paid for elite training camps. When he wanted to attend a prestigious private high school, they paid the $40,000 annual tuition without hesitation. When he decided to pursue a business degree at an Ivy League university, they covered every expense and bought him a luxury car to drive on campus. My experience was markedly different. I was not neglected in the obvious ways that would draw attention or concern from outside observers. I had adequate clothing, sufficient food, and a room in our large suburban home. But the disparity in how my parents treated their 2 children was unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. Where Trevor received encouragement and investment, I received criticism and indifference. When I was 14 years old, I discovered a passion for writing. I filled notebooks with stories and poems, creating fictional worlds that felt more real and more welcoming than my actual home environment. I showed some of my work to my English teacher, Mrs. Palmer, who was enthusiastic and encouraging. She told me I had genuine talent and suggested I submit some pieces to young writers' competitions and literary magazines for teenagers. I came home excited one afternoon and told my parents about Mrs. Palmer's encouragement and my hope to pursue writing more seriously. My father barely looked up from the financial reports he was reviewing. My mother's response was more direct and more crushing. "Writing is not a practical skill," she said dismissively. "It is a hobby, not a career path. You need to focus on developing abilities that will lead to stable employment. Have you considered studying something useful like accounting or nursing?" When I protested that I genuinely loved writing and wanted to develop that talent, my father finally engaged with the conversation, but not in the way I had hoped. "Rachel, your brother is pursuing a serious education that will position him for significant professional success. We expect you to be similarly practical in your choices. Creative pursuits are fine as leisure activities, but they cannot be the foundation of a responsible adult life." The message was clear and consistently reinforced throughout my adolescence. My interests and aspirations were frivolous and unworthy of support. The contrast with how they responded to Trevor's interests could not have been more stark. When Trevor expressed casual interest in photography during his junior year of high school, my parents immediately purchased professional-grade camera equipment costing several $1,000s. When I asked for a laptop computer to make my writing easier, I was told that was an unnecessary expense, and I should continue using the family desktop computer in the living room where I had no privacy. I learned to stop sharing my creative work with my parents. I learned to stop expecting their interest or support. I focused on doing well enough in school to avoid criticism while pursuing my writing privately, sharing my work only with Mrs. Palmer and a few trusted friends who appreciated what I was trying to create. When I graduated from high school, the question of college became a source of significant family tension. My grades were strong and I had been accepted to several good universities, including one with an excellent creative writing program. My parents made it clear they would provide minimal financial support for my education, in stark contrast to the unlimited funding they had provided for Trevor. "We have already invested substantially in your brother's education," My mother explained during a tense dinner conversation in the spring of my senior year. We cannot afford to provide the same level of support for you. If you want to attend university, you will need to take out loans and work to support yourself. We will help with some basic costs, but you need to understand that your education is primarily your responsibility. The amount of help they offered was $5,000 per year, barely enough to cover textbooks and basic supplies. For comparison, they were spending over $60,000 annually on Trevor's Ivy League education, plus his living expenses, car payments, and spending money. I made the difficult decision to attend a state university where tuition was more affordable. I took out substantial student loans. I worked 25 hours per week at a campus bookstore to cover my living expenses. I chose to major in English with a focus on creative writing despite my parents' disapproval, because it was the only field of study that held any genuine interest for me. College was challenging financially and emotionally, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued creativity and intellectual exploration, who did not dismiss artistic pursuits as frivolous wastes of time. My professors recognized my abilities and encouraged me to develop them. I began publishing short stories in literary magazines and won several university writing competitions. During my junior year, I met Daniel Carter in an American literature seminar. Daniel was studying education with plans to become a high school English teacher. He came from a working-class family in rural Vermont where both of his parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. His experience was different from mine, but we connected over shared values about what mattered in life. Daniel believed that teaching and nurturing young minds was worthwhile work even though it would never make him wealthy. He respected my commitment to writing even though it offered no guarantee of financial success. We began dating and quickly developed a relationship characterized by mutual support and genuine respect. Daniel understood what it was like to pursue something meaningful over something merely lucrative. His family, despite their limited resources, had supported his decision to become a teacher because they valued education and believed his work would matter. The contrast with my own family's attitude was striking and painful. Daniel and I married shortly after graduation in a small ceremony attended by friends and his family. My parents came to the wedding but made it clear through their demeanor and minimal participation that they viewed the entire event as disappointing. My mother made several comments about how small and simple the ceremony was compared to the elaborate wedding she envisioned I should have had. My father spent most of the reception talking on his phone about business matters. Trevor attended but left early, claiming he had important professional obligations. The only member of my family who seemed genuinely happy for me was my maternal grandmother, Ruth Anderson. Grandma Ruth was 78 years old and had always been warmer and more accepting than my parents. She had been a librarian before retiring and had always encouraged my love of reading and writing. She gave us a generous check as a wedding gift and told me privately that she was proud of the woman I had become. Daniel and I moved to a small city in Massachusetts where he had secured a teaching position at a public high school. I found work as a copywriter for a small marketing agency, writing website content and advertising materials for local businesses. The work was not creatively fulfilling, but it paid reasonably well and had regular hours that allowed me to write fiction in the evenings and on weekends. We lived frugally in a modest apartment, managing our student loan payments and trying to save money. Our life was simple but happy. Daniel loved his students and found his work meaningful despite the modest teacher's salary. I continued writing and submitting my stories to literary magazines and competitions, slowly building a portfolio of published work. 2 years after we married, I became pregnant. The pregnancy was unplanned but welcomed. Daniel and I had discussed starting a family eventually, though we had thought we would wait until we were more financially stable. But the reality of becoming parents filled us both with excitement and purpose. I called my parents to share the news, hoping that becoming grandparents might soften their attitude toward me and create an opportunity for a better relationship. My mother's response was tepid at best. She congratulated me in a tone that suggested obligation rather than genuine happiness. She asked whether we could afford a child given our modest incomes. She wondered aloud whether I had considered how a baby would impact my career prospects. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father's reaction was similarly underwhelming. He asked practical questions about our health insurance coverage and whether we had adequate savings to handle the medical expenses associated with pregnancy and childbirth. There was no expression of joy or excitement about the prospect of a grandchild. The contrast with Daniel's family was stark and painful. His parents were overjoyed. His mother cried happy tears when we told her. His father immediately began planning how he could help us prepare for the baby's arrival. They offered to give us baby furniture and supplies they had saved from when Daniel and his siblings were young. They made it clear that they considered this grandchild a blessing, and that they would be actively involved in supporting us. My daughter, Emma Rose Carter, was born in early April after a difficult labor that resulted in an emergency cesarean section. She was beautiful and healthy, weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces. Holding her for the first time, I felt a love that was overwhelming in its intensity. This tiny person was mine to protect and nurture. I would give her the support and unconditional acceptance I had never received from my own parents. My parents visited the hospital briefly the day after Emma was born. They stayed for perhaps 20 minutes, took a few obligatory photographs, and then left citing other commitments. They did not offer to help during my recovery period. They did not ask if we needed anything. Their engagement with their first grandchild was perfunctory and distant. Daniel's parents, by contrast, stayed with us for 2 weeks after we brought Emma home from the hospital. His mother cooked meals, did laundry, and helped with nighttime feeding so we could sleep. His father assembled furniture and completed household tasks that we had not had energy to address. They were present and helpful in ways that my own parents never considered being. The first 3 years of Emma's life were challenging but joyful. Daniel and I navigated the complexities of parenting while managing our professional responsibilities and financial constraints. We lived carefully, budgeting every dollar and making sacrifices to provide for Emma's needs, while continuing to pay down our student loans. We had little money for luxuries, but Emma was loved and well cared for. My relationship with my parents during this period remained distant and unsatisfying. They saw Emma perhaps 3 or 4 times per year, always briefly and always at their convenience. They never offered to babysit or to provide any kind of practical support. They sent modest gifts on her birthday and at holidays, but there was no real relationship developing between them and their granddaughter. I tried not to let their indifference hurt me, but it was difficult. I watched Daniel's parents develop a warm, loving relationship with Emma, visiting regularly and delighting in every milestone and achievement. I could not understand why my own parents were incapable of or uninterested in forming a similar bond with their grandchild. When Emma was 3 years old, I finally achieved a professional breakthrough that had seemed impossible during the difficult early years of parenting. I had continued writing fiction during stolen moments, submitting stories to literary magazines and contests whenever I could find time. One of my short stories won a significant national competition with a prize of $5,000 and publication in a prestigious literary journal. The recognition led to interest from a literary agent who believed my work had commercial potential. Over the following 18 months, working during Emma's nap times and after she went to bed at night, I completed a novel. My agent successfully sold it to a mid-sized publishing house for an advance of $40,000. The novel would be published the following year. This was the validation I had dreamed of since I was 14 years old, filling notebooks with stories. I had proven that my writing was not merely a frivolous hobby, but a genuine skill with professional value. I called my parents to share this news, hoping they might finally acknowledge that I had achieved something meaningful. My mother's response was characteristic of her general attitude toward my life choices. She congratulated me briefly, and then immediately shifted the conversation to Trevor's recent promotion at his investment firm. My father asked how much money I expected to earn from the book, and seemed unimpressed when I explained that most authors do not become wealthy from their writing. There was no pride in their voices. There was no acknowledgement that I had accomplished something significant in a highly competitive field. There was only the familiar indifference that had characterized their attitude toward me throughout my entire life. I realized then with painful clarity that nothing I achieved would ever be sufficient to earn their respect or approval. Their contempt for my choices was not based on my level of success or failure. It was based on their fundamental belief that creative work was less valuable than the corporate and financial careers they deemed respectable. No amount of achievement in my chosen field would change their perspective. This realization was liberating in an unexpected way. I stopped seeking their validation. I stopped hoping that the next accomplishment might finally make them proud. I accepted that we simply had fundamentally different values, and that attempting to bridge that gap was a futile exercise that only caused me pain. Emma was 4 years old when she began experiencing troubling symptoms that would lead to the crisis that permanently severed my relationship with my family. She started complaining of frequent headaches. She became unusually tired, falling asleep in the middle of the day when she had previously been energetic and active. She experienced occasional dizziness and balance problems that caused her to stumble or fall. Initially, our pediatrician thought these symptoms might be related to routine childhood illnesses or growth patterns. But when the symptoms persisted and worsened over several weeks, she referred us to a pediatric neurologist for further evaluation. The neurologist ordered an MRI scan of Emma's brain. The results of that scan changed everything. The imaging revealed a tumor in Emma's brain, located in the posterior fossa region near the cerebellum. The neurologist explained that while not all brain tumors are cancerous, any growth in that location required immediate attention because of the risk of pressure buildup and interference with critical brain functions. We were referred to a pediatric neurosurgeon at a major children's hospital in Boston. The surgeon reviewed Emma's scans and recommended surgery to remove the tumor as soon as possible. He explained that the procedure was complex and carried risks, but that delaying surgery would be more dangerous than proceeding promptly. The tumor was growing and would eventually cause severe complications if not addressed. Daniel and I were devastated and terrified. Our beautiful, vibrant 4-year-old daughter needed brain surgery. The neurosurgeon tried to be reassuring, explaining that he had performed this type of surgery many times and that outcomes were generally good, but we understood that there were no guarantees when someone was operating on your child's brain. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks from the consultation, the earliest date that could be arranged given the surgeon's schedule and the necessary preoperative preparations. Those 3 weeks were the longest and most frightening of our lives. We tried to maintain normalcy for Emma's sake, while privately researching everything we could about pediatric brain tumors and surgical procedures. We met with the surgical team multiple times to understand exactly what would happen. We completed all the required preoperative testing and consultations. I called my parents to inform them of Emma's diagnosis and upcoming surgery. I explained the situation in detail, describing the tumor location and the surgical plan. I told them the specific date and time of the surgery at the Boston Children's Hospital. I did not explicitly ask them to be there, but I hoped they would understand that this was a moment when family support would matter, when their granddaughter was facing a medical crisis that could have life-altering consequences. My mother's response was measured and controlled. She expressed appropriate concern and said she hoped the surgery would go well. She did not offer to come to the hospital. She did not ask how Daniel and I were coping. She did not ask if there was anything we needed. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes before she said she needed to go because she had a property showing scheduled. My father was similarly distant when I spoke with him. He asked a few questions about the medical details and then made vague comments about hoping for the best. He did not mention the possibility of visiting or being present during the surgery. When I ended the call, I felt a familiar emptiness that came from seeking support from people who were incapable of providing it. The day of Emma's surgery arrived on a cold morning in November. We had to be at the hospital by 5:30 in the morning for preoperative preparation. The surgery itself was expected to last between 4 and 6 hours. Daniel and I would be waiting in the surgical family lounge during that entire time, hoping and praying that our daughter would emerge from the operating room healthy and intact. Daniel's parents drove down from Vermont the night before and stayed in a hotel near the hospital so they could be with us during the surgery. They arrived at the hospital shortly after we did, bringing coffee and breakfast pastries they had picked up along the way. They sat with us during the preparation period, playing quietly with Emma and trying to keep the atmosphere calm despite the underlying fear we all felt. My parents did not come. My mother did not call or send a message that morning. My father did not reach out. Trevor, who lived less than 2 hours from the Boston hospital, did not appear or contact us. My family's absence during what was unquestionably one of the most frightening experiences of my life was absolute and unmistakable. When the surgical team came to take Emma back to the operating room, I held her small hand and told her I loved her, and that I would be right there waiting when she woke up. She looked so tiny in the hospital gown, so vulnerable and trusting. Daniel and I both kissed her forehead as they wheeled her away, and then we returned to the waiting area to begin the long, agonizing wait. Daniel's parents stayed with us the entire time. They brought us food we were too anxious to eat. They sat beside us offering quiet comfort when words failed. They prayed with us. They reminded us that the surgeon was skilled and experienced, that Emma was strong, that we had to maintain hope. During those 6 hours of waiting, I checked my phone repeatedly, hoping to see a message from my parents or Trevor expressing support or concern. Nothing came. The silence from my family was deafening. When the surgeon finally emerged from the operating room and told us that the surgery had been successful, that they had removed the entire tumor and that Emma was stable and recovering, I collapsed into Daniel's arms sobbing with relief. His parents embraced us both, crying their own tears of gratitude and joy. We had survived the most terrifying day of our lives, and we had done so without a single member of my biological family bothering to be present or even to check how things were proceeding. That night, after Daniel's parents had returned to their hotel and Daniel had gone to get us both coffee from the cafeteria, I sat alone in Emma's hospital room watching my daughter sleep peacefully despite all the monitors and 4 lines still connected to her small body. I made a decision in that quiet moment that I had been moving toward for many years, but had finally been forced to confront directly. My parents and brother were not family in any meaningful sense of that word. They shared my DNA, but they did not share my life or my love, or my commitment to being present for the people who mattered. I was finished trying to maintain a relationship with people who had demonstrated through countless actions that they did not value me or my daughter. Whatever happened moving forward, I would build my life around the people who had actually shown up when it counted. I had no way of knowing then that within 2 months, those same absent family members would appear at my home demanding $15,000 and would set in motion a series of events that would finally and permanently prove exactly who they were and what they valued. But I would learn soon enough, and the lesson would be one I would never forget. Emma's recovery from brain surgery proceeded remarkably well given the complexity of the procedure she had undergone. The neurosurgeon had successfully removed the entire tumor, and the pathology report that came back 3 days after surgery confirmed that it was a low-grade pilocytic astrocytoma, a type of growth that was typically benign and unlikely to recur once completely resected. This news brought tremendous relief after weeks of uncertainty and fear about what we might be facing. The immediate postoperative period required Emma to remain in the pediatric intensive care unit for careful monitoring. She experienced some expected side effects from the surgery, including nausea, dizziness, and fatigue, but she did not develop any of the serious complications that the surgical team had warned us could potentially occur. Her neurological function remained intact. She could move all her limbs normally. Her speech was clear and coherent. Her personality and cognitive abilities appeared unchanged by the operation. Daniel and I took turns staying overnight at the hospital during Emma's week-long admission, one of us always present in her room while the other went home to shower, change clothes, and attempt to maintain some basic household functions. Daniel's parents continued to provide extraordinary support during this period. They brought us meals and clean clothes. They handled communications with Daniel's school to arrange for his substitute teacher coverage. They took care of practical matters we simply did not have the mental or emotional capacity to address, while our focus remained entirely on Emma's recovery. My parents called once during Emma's hospital stay, approximately 3 days after the surgery. My mother phoned in the evening and asked how Emma was doing. I provided a brief update on her recovery progress. My mother said she was glad to hear things were going well, and then quickly transitioned the conversation to other topics. She mentioned that Trevor had received another promotion at his investment firm. She talked about a luxury property listing she was trying to close. She asked if I had heard anything from my publisher about release plans for my novel. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes and felt perfunctory, as though she were fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine concern for her granddaughter's health crisis. My father did not call at all. Trevor sent a single text message 2 days after the surgery asking if Emma was okay, and saying he hoped she recovered quickly. When I responded with details about her condition and recovery timeline, he did not reply. The minimal engagement from my family during what was unquestionably one of the most significant medical events in our lives was hurtful but not surprising. Their absence during the actual surgery had already demonstrated exactly where we ranked in their priorities. Emma was discharged from the hospital 7 days after her surgery. The neurosurgeon provided detailed instructions for her recovery at home. She would need to avoid strenuous physical activity for several weeks. She would require regular follow-up appointments to monitor her healing progress. She would need to take anti-seizure medication as a precautionary measure for several months. But overall, the prognosis was excellent. The surgeon was confident that with proper healing time, Emma would return to completely normal function with no long-term limitations. Returning home with Emma felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into daylight. The fear that had dominated every moment since her diagnosis began to recede, replaced by cautious optimism and profound gratitude that the surgery had been successful. Our daughter was safe. The tumor was gone. She would recover fully and resume her normal childhood without the shadow of this medical crisis hanging over her future. The following weeks were focused entirely on Emma's recovery and our family's adjustment to life after such a traumatic experience. I had taken a leave of absence from my copywriting position to provide full-time care during Emma's healing period. Daniel returned to his teaching responsibilities but came home immediately after school each day to help with Emma's care. We established a routine of rest, gentle activities, medication schedules, and regular monitoring for any concerning symptoms. Daniel's parents visited frequently, bringing meals and entertainment for Emma, sitting with her while she watched movies or worked on quiet craft projects, giving Daniel and me opportunities to rest or handle necessary tasks. Their consistent presence and practical support during this challenging period reinforced what we had learned during the surgery itself. Family is defined not by biological connection but by who shows up when showing up matters. I sent a brief email to my parents updating them on Emma's discharge from the hospital and her recovery progress at home. I included details about the positive prognosis and the surgeon's confidence in her complete recovery. My mother responded with a short message saying she was pleased to hear the good news. My father did not respond at all. Neither of them suggested visiting to see Emma or offered any kind of assistance during her recovery period. Their indifference no longer surprised me, but it did solidify the decision I had made while sitting in Emma's hospital room the night of her surgery. I was finished attempting to maintain a relationship with people who had demonstrated repeatedly that they were unwilling or unable to function as family in any meaningful way. I would focus my energy and emotional resources on the people who had actually been present during our crisis, and who continued to show up in our daily lives. As Emma's physical recovery progressed, and she began returning to her normal energy level and activities, Daniel and I faced the financial implications of her medical crisis. Despite having health insurance through Daniel's teaching position, the expenses associated with Emma's diagnosis, surgery, and hospitalization were substantial. Our insurance had a high deductible of $5,000 that had to be met before coverage began. Even after the deductible was satisfied, we were responsible for 20% of all costs as coinsurance. The total amount we owed for Emma's medical care exceeded $18,000. This was a staggering sum for our household budget. Our combined annual income was approximately $75,000 before taxes. We had modest savings that we had been slowly accumulating, but nothing close to the amount now required to pay Emma's medical bills. We had student loans we were still repaying. We had regular living expenses including rent, utilities, food, transportation, and childcare costs. Adding $18,000 in medical debt to our existing financial obligations felt overwhelming. The hospital and various medical providers began sending bills and payment requests within weeks of Emma's discharge. We contacted the billing departments to establish payment plans, agreeing to monthly installments that we could barely afford, but that would at least prevent the bills from going to collections and damaging our credit. We cut our already modest budget to the absolute minimum, eliminating any discretionary spending and focusing solely on essential expenses. During this period, my novel was released by the publishing house. The publication represented the culmination of years of work and the realization of dreams I had held since adolescence. Under different circumstances, I would have been consumed with excitement and promotion activities. But with Emma's recent surgery and our mounting medical debt, The book launch felt almost secondary to the immediate concerns dominating our lives. The novel received positive reviews from literary critics and sold reasonably well for a debut literary fiction release. I did some promotional activities, including readings at independent bookstores and interviews with local media outlets. But my focus remained primarily on Emma's continued recovery and on finding ways to address our financial situation. The advance I had received for the book had already been spent on living expenses during the months I had worked to complete the manuscript, so the royalties trickling in from sales were modest and would not significantly impact our debt situation. 2 months after Emma's surgery, on a cold January afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. This was unusual because our communication had been minimal since Emma's hospitalization and consisted primarily of brief emails rather than actual phone conversations. When I answered, my mother's tone was friendly in a way that immediately raised my suspicions. She rarely contacted me without specific purpose, and false warmth typically indicated she wanted something. After brief pleasantries and cursory questions about Emma's recovery, my mother transitioned to the actual reason for her call. She explained that she and my father were planning to purchase a vacation property in coastal Maine, something they had been considering for several years as a retirement investment and family gathering place. They had found an ideal property but needed to move quickly to secure it before other interested buyers made offers. The property required a cash down payment of $50,000, my mother explained. They had most of this amount available in liquid assets, but they were approximately $15,000 short of what they needed to close the deal within the required timeframe. She was calling to ask if I could lend them this amount to help them complete the purchase. I was so stunned by the audacity of this request that I initially could not formulate a response. My daughter had undergone emergency brain surgery 2 months earlier. My parents had not been present for the surgery, had barely communicated during her hospitalization, had not visited during her recovery, and had offered no assistance whatsoever with the significant medical expenses we were now struggling to pay. And now my mother was calling to ask me for $15,000 to help purchase a vacation home. When I found my voice, I asked whether she was serious. My mother seemed surprised by my reaction. She explained that this was simply a loan, that they would pay me back with interest within 6 months, once they had liquidated some other investments. She characterized it as a mutually beneficial arrangement that would help them secure this property, while providing me with a small return on the money. I asked if she remembered that Emma had just had brain surgery. I asked if she was aware that we were facing $18,000 in medical debt. I asked if it had occurred to her that we might not have $15,000 available to lend to anyone for any reason, much less for something as unnecessary as a vacation home purchase. My mother's tone shifted from friendly to defensive. She said that our financial situation was not her responsibility, and was the result of choices Daniel and I had made about our careers and lifestyle. She pointed out that if we had pursued more lucrative professions instead of teaching and writing, we would be better equipped to handle unexpected medical expenses. She suggested that our financial stress was self-imposed, and not something she should be expected to accommodate when making reasonable requests for family assistance. Her words ignited anger that I had been suppressing for decades. I told her that family assistance was exactly what she and my father had failed to provide when it actually mattered. I reminded her that neither she nor my father had been present for Emma's surgery, that they had not called to check on us during the terrifying hours we spent waiting to learn if our daughter would survive the operation, that they had not visited during her recovery, that they had not offered even minimal emotional or practical support during the worst crisis our family had ever faced. I told her that asking me for money under these circumstances demonstrated a level of self-centered obliviousness that I found genuinely shocking even given my low expectations for their behavior. I told her the answer was absolutely not, that we did not have $15,000 to lend to anyone, and that even if we did have that amount available, I would never consider giving it to people who had so thoroughly failed to function as family when we needed them. My mother's response was cold and sharp. She said I was being unreasonable and vindictive, that I was using Emma's surgery as an excuse to reject a simple request from family members who had always supported me despite my questionable life choices. She said that holding grudges over perceived slights was childish, and that I needed to grow up and understand that adults had obligations and responsibilities that sometimes prevented them from being available during inconvenient situations. I told her that emergency brain surgery for her granddaughter was not an inconvenient situation, it was a life-threatening medical crisis, and that any grandparent who characterized it as a mere inconvenience had disqualified themselves from claiming any kind of family relationship. I told her I was done with the conversation, and that she should not contact me again with requests for money or for anything else. My mother said I would regret speaking to her this way, that family relationships required give and take, and that my refusal to help them when they needed it would have consequences. I ended the call without responding to her vague threat. I was shaking with anger and emotional exhaustion after that conversation. Daniel arrived home from school shortly after, and found me sitting at our kitchen table staring at nothing. When I recounted what had happened, his reaction mirrored my own disbelief and fury. He could not comprehend the thought process that would lead someone to ask their daughter for $15,000 to buy a vacation home 2 months after that daughter's child had undergone emergency surgery, particularly when they had provided no support whatsoever during the medical crisis. I tried to put the conversation out of my mind and focus on more important things. Emma continued recovering well, and was preparing to return to preschool the following week now that the surgeon had cleared her for normal activities. My publisher was planning some additional promotional events for my novel. Daniel's school semester was proceeding smoothly. We were gradually adjusting to the reality of our medical debt and the payment plans we had established. Life was returning to something approaching normalcy after the trauma of the previous months. 3 weeks after my mother's phone call requesting money, I received a notice in the mail from our bank. The letter informed me that a hold had been placed on our checking account, pending investigation of potentially fraudulent activity. I was instructed to contact the bank immediately to resolve the issue and provide documentation proving my identity and account ownership. I called the bank's customer service number with growing anxiety. Frozen bank accounts were serious problems that could prevent us from paying our rent and other essential expenses. When I finally reached a representative and verified my identity, I asked what fraudulent activity had triggered the hold on our account. The representative explained that the bank had received a report from someone claiming to be a family member stating that I had potentially gained access to their financial information and might be attempting to conduct unauthorized transactions. The report had been filed by someone named Carolyn Morrison, who identified herself as my mother. Bank policy required them to investigate any claims of potential fraud or identity theft, which meant temporarily freezing the account until the matter could be resolved. I felt as though I had been physically struck. My mother had called our bank and made false claims about fraudulent activity in retaliation for my refusal to lend her money. She had weaponized the banking system to create financial chaos in our lives, because I had declined to help fund her vacation home purchase. I explained to the bank representative that this was a malicious false report filed by a family member with whom I was estranged, that there was no fraudulent activity on my account, and that I needed the hold removed immediately because we had bills and obligations that required access to our funds. The representative was sympathetic, but explained that bank policy required a formal investigation process that would take several business days to complete. In the meantime, our account would remain frozen. I spent the next hour on the phone with various bank departments, providing documentation of my identity, explaining the situation, and requesting expedited resolution of this manufactured crisis. I filed a formal complaint about the fraudulent report and asked what consequences would face the person who had made false claims to the bank. The bank eventually removed the hold on our account after I had provided extensive documentation proving my identity and account ownership, but the entire process took 3 days during which we could not access our money to pay for groceries, gas, or any other expenses. We were forced to rely on credit cards and the financial assistance of Daniel's parents to cover our immediate needs during this period. When our account access was finally restored, I was beyond anger. My mother had not simply asked for money and been disappointed when refused. She had actively attempted to sabotage our financial stability by filing false reports with our bank. This was not mere selfishness or indifference. This was malicious retaliation that demonstrated a level of vindictiveness I had not previously understood she possessed. I contacted an attorney to discuss whether my mother's actions constituted harassment or some form of actionable misconduct. The attorney explained that while her behavior was certainly unethical and had caused us tangible harm, pursuing legal action would be expensive and time-consuming with uncertain outcomes. He suggested that the best course of action was to document everything that had occurred, to ensure all our financial accounts had robust security measures in place, and to cease all contact with family members who had demonstrated themselves to be hostile. I followed his advice. I documented every interaction with my parents related to the money request and the bank incident. I changed all my account passwords and security questions. I contacted our bank and placed additional security measures on our accounts that would require multiple forms of verification before any changes could be made. I blocked my parents' phone numbers and email addresses to prevent further direct contact. Most importantly, I accepted with finality that these people were not family in any meaningful sense, and that any lingering hope I had held for eventual reconciliation or improvement in our relationship was a fantasy that needed to be abandoned. They had shown me exactly who they were through their absence during Emma's surgery, and through their retaliation when I refused to fund their luxury purchase. I needed to believe them and act accordingly. The experience was painful but clarifying. Sometimes the most important lesson you can learn is recognizing when relationships are not salvageable, and when your energy is better invested in protecting yourself and the people who genuinely matter to you rather than continuing to seek connection with those who have proven themselves incapable of reciprocating care or respect. Emma was thriving in her recovery, returning to preschool with energy and enthusiasm. Daniel and I were managing our medical debt through disciplined budgeting and payment plans. My novel continued to receive positive attention and modest but steady sales. We had supportive friends and Daniel's parents who functioned as the real family in our lives. We were building something meaningful despite the obstacles we faced, and we were doing so without the people who had contributed nothing but disappointment and now actual sabotage to our lives. I did not know then that my parents' story was not quite finished, that their final act would be even more revealing of their character, and that the resolution would ultimately provide me with the closure and peace I had been seeking throughout my entire adult life. The months following the bank incident brought a peculiar sense of liberation that I had not anticipated. After years of maintaining a strained and unsatisfying relationship with my parents out of some combination of obligation, hope, and habit, the complete severing of contact created space in my life that I had not realized was being consumed by emotional labor and disappointment. I no longer checked my phone anxiously wondering if they might call. I no longer felt the familiar knot of tension when holidays approached, and I had to navigate the question of whether to attempt family gatherings that would inevitably leave me feeling inadequate and unwelcome. I no longer invested energy in hoping that this time might be different, that they might finally demonstrate the kind of care and support that parents are supposed to provide. Instead, I redirected that energy toward the relationships and pursuits that actually enriched my life. Emma's complete recovery from her surgery was the most significant blessing. By early spring, approximately 5 months after the operation, she had returned entirely to her normal self. The surgeon's follow-up appointments confirmed that she was healing perfectly with no complications or concerning symptoms. Her energy level was back to what it had been before the tumor began affecting her health. She was thriving in preschool, making friends and engaging enthusiastically with learning activities. The scar on her head where the surgical incision had been made was barely visible beneath her hair, and would likely fade to near invisibility as she continued growing. Watching Emma play and laugh without any sign of the medical trauma she had endured filled me with profound gratitude every single day. We had come terrifyingly close to losing her, or seeing her permanently affected by either the tumor itself or complications from the surgery. The fact that she had emerged from that experience healthy and whole felt miraculous. I no longer took for granted the simple joy of seeing my daughter run and play, and explore her world without limitation. Daniel and I had also made significant progress on addressing the medical debt that had seemed so overwhelming in the immediate aftermath of Emma's hospitalization. Through strict budgeting and payment plans, we had reduced the total amount owed from $18,000 to approximately $11,000 over the course of 6 months. The monthly payments were still a strain on our budget, but we could see measurable progress and could project a timeline for eventually eliminating this debt entirely. We had learned to live even more frugally than we had before, cutting expenses we had previously considered necessary, and finding creative ways to meet our needs without spending money we did not have. My copywriting work had remained stable throughout this period, providing the steady income we needed to maintain our basic living expenses and meet our debt obligations. The work was not particularly fulfilling creatively, but it was reliable and flexible enough that I could manage it while still being available for Emma's needs and recovery appointments. I had developed a reputation among my clients for delivering quality work on deadline, which meant I received regular assignments without having to constantly seek new business. More significantly, my novel had continued to perform better than either I or my publisher had initially anticipated for a debut literary fiction release. The book had been well reviewed in several major publications, and positive word of mouth among readers had led to steady sales that extended well beyond the typical launch period for new releases. My literary agent had begun receiving inquiries from film and television producers interested in adaptation rights, though nothing had advanced beyond preliminary conversations. Still, the ongoing attention to the book represented validation of my work and potential opportunities for future income. My publisher had approached me about writing a second novel, offering another contract with an advance of $60,000, substantially more than the $40,000 I had received for the first book. This was both exciting and daunting. I knew that writing another novel while managing my copywriting work and Emma's needs would be extremely challenging from a time management perspective, but the advance would provide meaningful financial relief and would help establish me as a professional author rather than someone who had written one book and then disappeared from the literary landscape. I negotiated a delivery timeline of 18 months for the manuscript, which would give me time to develop the story properly while balancing my other responsibilities. I signed the contract in late spring and began working on early development of the new novel, outlining the story structure and developing the characters during whatever spare moments I could find. Writing had always been the work that felt most authentic and meaningful to me, and having the opportunity to do it as my primary professional focus, rather than as a side pursuit I squeezed into stolen hours, felt like a significant step toward the kind of life I had imagined when I first decided to study creative writing. During this period, Daniel's teaching career also advanced in meaningful ways. He had been offered a position as the English department chair at his high school, a role that came with additional responsibilities but also a modest salary increase and more influence over curriculum decisions and departmental culture. Daniel had always been passionate about education and about creating learning environments where students felt supported and inspired. The department chair position allowed him to extend his impact beyond his own classroom and to mentor newer teachers who were just beginning their careers. The salary increase from Daniel's promotion, while not dramatic, provided additional financial breathing room that made a real difference in our budget. We were able to accelerate our medical debt payments and to begin rebuilding the modest emergency savings that had been depleted during Emma's medical crisis. We remained financially constrained compared to many of our peers, but we were stable and making progress toward our goals. More importantly, we were both engaged in work that felt meaningful rather than simply collecting paychecks from jobs we tolerated but did not value. Emma had begun attending a new preschool program that focused on arts integration and creative learning, an approach that seemed well suited to her personality and interests. We had chosen this program carefully, wanting an environment where she would be nurtured and encouraged, rather than simply warehoused during the day while we worked. The program was more expensive than more conventional preschool options, but we had decided it was worth the investment in our daughter's development and happiness. Watching Emma thrive in this environment reinforced our conviction that the choices Daniel and I had made about prioritizing meaningful work over maximum income had been correct despite the financial constraints those choices created. Emma was growing up in a household where both parents were engaged in work they cared about, where creativity and learning were valued, where people were judged by their character and contributions rather than their earning potential or professional status. These were the values we wanted to instill in our daughter, and we could only teach them authentically by living them ourselves. Daniel's parents continued to be actively involved in our lives and in their relationship with Emma. They visited at least once a month, usually staying for extended weekends during which they would spend hours playing with Emma, taking her on outings, and simply being present as engaged and loving grandparents. They had established traditions with her like Sunday morning pancake breakfasts and bedtime story sessions that Emma looked forward to with genuine excitement. The contrast between their warm, consistent presence and my parents' complete absence was stark, and became more noticeable as Emma grew old enough to recognize that she had one set of grandparents who loved her actively and visibly while the other set never visited or called. Emma had begun asking occasional questions about why she did not see my parents. She understood that she had maternal grandparents who existed somewhere, but who were not part of her regular life. I struggled with how to explain this situation in age-appropriate terms that would not burden her with adult conflicts, or make her feel somehow responsible for their absence. I eventually settled on simple explanations that my parents lived far away and were very busy with their work, which was true enough without going into the painful details of their fundamental disinterest and our estrangement. I wondered sometimes whether my parents ever thought about what they were missing by maintaining no relationship with their granddaughter. Emma was a remarkable child, bright and curious and affectionate. Knowing her was a privilege and a joy. My parents had chosen to forfeit that opportunity because maintaining a relationship with her would have required them to also maintain some kind of relationship with me, and they had demonstrated through their actions that they considered that obligation more burdensome than the loss of connection with their only grandchild was costly. Their choice still hurt when I allowed myself to think about it directly, but the pain had evolved from the acute wound of active rejection to the duller ache of accepted loss. I had grieved the parents I wished I had and had accepted the reality of the parents I actually had. This acceptance did not mean I was unbothered by their absence, but it meant I was no longer surprised or devastated by it. I had adjusted my expectations to align with demonstrated reality, rather than continuing to hope for transformation that was never going to occur. In early summer, approximately 8 months after the bank incident that had marked the final severance of communication with my parents, I received an unexpected email from my brother Trevor. This was startling because Trevor and I had maintained virtually no direct contact throughout our adult lives. Our relationship had always been distant and superficial, characterized more by rivalry and comparison than by genuine sibling affection. Trevor had been the favored child who received all parental investment and approval, while I had been the disappointing younger sibling whose choices were constantly criticized. We had never developed the kind of bond that siblings often share because our positions within the family hierarchy had been so disparate that we experienced entirely different childhoods despite growing up in the same household. Trevor's email was brief and direct. He wrote that he wanted to talk with me about our parents and about family matters that he felt needed to be addressed. He suggested we meet for coffee in a location roughly midway between where we both lived. He emphasized that he was reaching out on his own initiative, not at our parents' request, and that he thought a conversation would be beneficial for both of us. I was immediately suspicious of Trevor's motives. We had not had a meaningful conversation in years. His sudden interest in discussing family matters seemed unlikely to be motivated by genuine concern for relationship repair. More probably, he wanted something or had been designated by our parents to communicate something they preferred not to address directly with me. Still, curiosity overcame my skepticism enough that I agreed to meet him, though I did so with clear boundaries about what I was and was not willing to discuss. We met at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning in late June. Trevor arrived dressed in expensive business casual clothing that telegraphed his financial success and professional status. He had always cared deeply about appearances and about being perceived as successful according to conventional metrics. He ordered an elaborate coffee drink and made small talk about traffic and weather before transitioning to the actual purpose of our meeting. Trevor began by acknowledging that our family relationships had been strained and complicated. He said he recognized that our parents had treated us differently, and that I had legitimate grievances about how they had failed to support me in ways they had supported him. This acknowledgement was surprising coming from someone who had benefited enormously from the inequitable distribution of parental resources and attention. I waited for the inevitable qualifier that would undermine this seemingly genuine recognition. Trevor explained that our parents were upset about the complete breakdown in their relationship with me. He said they felt I had overreacted to the situation surrounding Emma's surgery and the subsequent request for financial assistance. They believed I was being unreasonable in refusing all contact and in preventing them from having a relationship with their granddaughter. Trevor had volunteered to serve as an intermediary to see if some kind of reconciliation or at least basic communication could be reestablished. I asked Trevor directly whether he was aware that our parents had not attended Emma's brain surgery. He admitted that he knew they had not been present at the hospital but suggested there might have been circumstances or obligations that prevented them from attending that I was not fully aware of. I asked whether he was aware that they had called our bank and filed false reports about fraudulent activity in retaliation for my refusal to lend them money for a vacation home purchase. Trevor looked uncomfortable and said he had heard something about a misunderstanding with a bank, but did not know the details. I provided Trevor with a detailed account of everything that had occurred. I explained that our parents had not called or visited during Emma's week-long hospitalization following surgery. I described my mother's phone call 2 months after the surgery requesting $15,000 to help purchase a vacation property without any acknowledgement of the medical crisis we had just endured or the financial burden we were managing. I explained the bank incident and the 3 days during which we had no access to our money, because our mother had filed false reports claiming potential fraud. Trevor listened with an expression that shifted from skepticism to discomfort as I recounted these events. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. He said he had not been aware of all these details, and that some of what I was describing did not align with the version of events our parents had shared with him. He acknowledged that if things had happened as I described, my reaction was more understandable than they had led him to believe. I told Trevor that I appreciated his willingness to listen but that I had no interest in reconciliation with our parents. They had demonstrated through consistent actions spanning my entire life that they were not capable of or interested in having a genuine parental relationship with me. The events surrounding Emma's surgery and its aftermath had simply been the final confirmation of what I had known for years. I was not angry at this point, I explained. I was simply done investing emotional energy in people who had proven repeatedly that they would not reciprocate that investment. Trevor said he understood my position but asked me to consider whether maintaining this estrangement was really in anyone's best interest. He pointed out that our parents were getting older, and that I might eventually regret not having any relationship with them. He suggested that perhaps some kind of limited contact could be established that would allow Emma to know her maternal grandparents without requiring me to have the kind of close relationship I clearly did not want. I told Trevor that our parents had already chosen not to have a relationship with Emma. They had not visited her during her medical crisis. They had not called on her birthday. They had not sent cards or gifts at holidays. They had demonstrated through their absence that they were not interested in being grandparents in any active sense. The estrangement was not something I was imposing on them. It was the natural result of their own choices and priorities. If they had wanted to be part of Emma's life, they could have shown up when it mattered. They had chosen not to, and I was simply accepting that choice rather than continuing to hope for something different. Trevor seemed frustrated by my unwillingness to consider reconciliation, but he eventually accepted that I had made a firm decision and was not going to be persuaded to change it. We finished our coffee with stilted conversation about neutral topics, and when we parted, it was with the understanding that we had fulfilled his mission of attempting mediation, and that further communication would likely be minimal or non-existent. Driving home from that meeting, I felt a sense of peace that surprised me. Trevor's attempt at reconciliation had actually reinforced my conviction that severing contact with my parents had been the correct decision. The fact that they had sent him to advocate on their behalf rather than reaching out directly demonstrated their continued inability to take genuine responsibility for their actions, or to make authentic efforts at relationship repair. They wanted the appearance of family connection without the actual work of being family. I had finally learned to stop accepting that false substitute for real relationship. That summer was characterized by contentment and forward momentum in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark months of Emma's diagnosis and surgery. My daughter was healthy and thriving. My marriage to Daniel was strong, built on shared values and mutual support through difficult circumstances. My writing career was developing in promising directions with a new book contract and ongoing attention to my debut novel. Our financial situation was improving gradually through disciplined debt repayment. We had genuine family in Daniel's parents and in chosen friends who had demonstrated their loyalty and care. I had learned through painful experience that family is not primarily a matter of biological connection, but rather of consistent presence and reciprocated care. The people who had shown up during Emma's surgery, and throughout the challenging months that followed, were my real family regardless of whether we shared DNA. The people who had been absent and who had actively tried to sabotage our financial stability when I refused to fund their luxury purchases had disqualified themselves from any claim to family status regardless of biological relationship. This realization was liberating in ways I continued to discover. I no longer carried the weight of trying to earn approval from people who were determined not to give it. I no longer twisted myself into shapes that felt inauthentic in hopes of finally being accepted on my own terms. I no longer made excuses for behavior that was inexcusable, or maintained hope for change that was never going to materialize. I had accepted reality and had built my life around that acceptance rather than around fantasy or obligation. The future felt full of possibility rather than constraint. I was writing the second novel and finding the work deeply satisfying. Emma was preparing to start kindergarten in the fall, a milestone that felt especially significant given how close we had come to losing her. Daniel was thriving in his new leadership role at his school. We were gradually building the kind of life we had envisioned when we first married, a life defined by meaningful work and genuine relationships, rather than by conventional measures of success that had never resonated with our values. I understood that challenges would continue to arise. Life always brings difficulties that cannot be anticipated or avoided. But I had learned through the ordeal of Emma's medical crisis and the final break with my parents that I had the resilience and the support system necessary to face whatever came. I was not alone in navigating difficulties. I had a partner who was committed to facing challenges together. I had extended family and friends who had proven their loyalty through action, rather than merely through words. I had discovered reserves of strength I had not known I possessed. Most importantly, I had learned to define success on my own terms, rather than accepting definitions imposed by others who did not share my values or understand my priorities. My parents had always measured worth through financial achievement and conventional professional status. By their metrics, I had failed by choosing teaching and writing over more lucrative careers. But by the metrics that actually mattered to me, I had succeeded in building a life of meaning and purpose and genuine connection. That success was real even though my parents could not or would not recognize it. The story of my relationship with my family was effectively concluded. There would be no dramatic reconciliation or transformation. There would be no moment when my parents suddenly recognized their failures and apologized meaningfully. There would simply be continued absence and the peace that came from accepting that absence rather than fighting against it. This ending was not what I had hoped for throughout most of my life, but it was honest and real. And it freed me to invest fully in the relationships and pursuits that actually enriched my existence, rather than diminishing it. The transition into autumn brought changes that reinforced the forward trajectory our lives had taken since the resolution of Emma's medical crisis and the final severance from my parents. Emma began kindergarten at the local public elementary school, a milestone that carried particular emotional weight, given how recently we had feared we might lose her entirely. Watching her board the school bus on that first morning, wearing her new backpack and carrying the lunch I had packed, I felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to my eyes. This ordinary moment of a child starting school was extraordinary, because we had come so close to never experiencing it. Emma adapted to kindergarten with enthusiasm and confidence. Her teacher reported that she was engaged in classroom activities, forming friendships with other children, and demonstrating strong academic readiness. There were no lingering effects from her surgery that impacted her learning or social development. She was simply a bright, curious 5-year-old girl navigating the new world of formal education with the same energy and optimism she brought to everything else in her life. The surgeon's prediction of complete recovery had been entirely accurate, and each day reinforced how fortunate we had been that the tumor had been discovered when it was and that the surgical outcome had been so positive. With Emma now in school full days, I had more uninterrupted time to focus on my writing work. I had been making steady progress on the second novel throughout the summer, working during Emma's preschool hours and in the evenings after she went to bed, but the expanded availability of focused writing time accelerated my productivity significantly. I established a routine of working on copywriting projects in the early mornings to generate the steady income we still needed, then dedicating afternoons to the novel manuscript. This division allowed me to maintain the financial stability provided by my copywriting work, while making meaningful progress on the creative work that felt most important to my long-term career development. The second novel was taking shape as a story about family estrangement and the process of building chosen family connections that replaced dysfunctional biological relationships. The parallels to my own experience were obvious, though not precisely autobiographical. I was channeling the emotional truth of what I had lived through into a fictional narrative that explored themes of belonging, acceptance, and the courage required to walk away from relationships that diminish rather than enhance your life. Writing this book felt both therapeutic and artistically satisfying in ways my first novel had not, Perhaps because I was working from a place of greater emotional clarity about what these themes meant and why they mattered. My literary agent had been keeping me updated on ongoing interest in film and television adaptation rights for my first novel. Several production companies had expressed interest in optioning the book, and by October we had received a formal offer from an independent film production company that specialized in character-driven literary adaptations. The offer included an option payment of $25,000 for the exclusive right to develop the book into a film over an 18-month period, with additional payments structured into the agreement if the project advanced to actual production. $25,000 represented more money than I had ever received at one time for my creative work. The amount would allow us to completely eliminate the remaining medical debt from Emma's surgery and to rebuild our emergency savings to a level that would provide genuine financial security. My agent advised that I should not expect the project would necessarily advance beyond the option stage, as the majority of option books never actually get produced as films, but even if nothing further materialized, the option payment itself was meaningful and the attention to my work could generate additional opportunities. I signed the option agreement in early November. When the payment arrived in my bank account 2 weeks later, Daniel and I sat together at our kitchen table and made the final payment on Emma's medical bills. After nearly a year of monthly installments that had strained our budget and required constant financial discipline, the debt was eliminated entirely. We were no longer carrying that burden. The relief was profound not just financially but emotionally. The medical crisis that had dominated our lives for so long was finally completely behind us in every practical sense. With the medical debt resolved and meaningful money remaining from the option payment, we made decisions about financial priorities that reflected how much our perspective had shifted through recent experiences. We established an emergency fund of $10,000, an amount that would cover several months of essential expenses if either of us lost income or faced another unexpected crisis. We had learned through painful experience that financial stability required maintaining reserves that could absorb shocks without forcing impossible choices or accumulating high-interest debt. We also decided to invest in some quality of life improvements that we had been deferring during the period of maximum financial constraint. We purchased a reliable used car to replace the aging vehicle that had been requiring increasingly frequent and expensive repairs. We updated some furniture in our apartment that had been salvaged from thrift stores years earlier and was showing significant wear. We took Emma on a weekend trip to an amusement park she had been asking to visit, an expenditure that would have been impossible to justify when we were managing medical debt, but that now felt like an appropriate celebration of her recovery and our improved circumstances. These were modest expenses compared to how many people with similar incomes might spend unexpected money, but they represented meaningful improvements in our daily lives, and a sense that we were finally moving beyond survival mode into something more sustainable and comfortable. We were still far from wealthy by any conventional measure, but we had achieved a level of financial stability that had seemed impossibly distant during the darkest periods of the previous year. My copywriting business also expanded during this period in ways that created additional income, without requiring proportionally more time investment. Several of my regular clients referred me to other businesses in their networks, and my reputation for delivering quality work on deadline had generated enough demand that I could be somewhat selective about which projects I accepted. I focused on taking assignments that paid well relative to the time required, and that did not demand the kind of intensive creative energy I wanted to reserve for my novel writing. This strategic approach to freelance work maximized my earning efficiency, while protecting the mental and emotional resources I needed for more meaningful creative projects. Daniel's work as English department chair had also been progressing well. He had implemented several curriculum innovations that were generating positive responses from both students and other teachers. He had been invited to present at a regional education conference about his approaches to teaching literature in ways that engaged reluctant readers. The recognition of his work beyond his immediate school environment validated his commitment to teaching and reinforced his belief that education was a profession where meaningful impact mattered more than high salary. We had settled into a life that felt balanced and purposeful in ways that our early years together, characterized by financial stress and constant uncertainty, had not allowed. We were both engaged in work we found meaningful. We were parenting Emma collaboratively and intentionally. We had supportive relationships with Daniel's parents and with a small circle of close friends. We had eliminated the debt that had been weighing on us and had established financial practices that provided security. We had learned through difficult experience what truly mattered and had organized our lives around those priorities, rather than around external expectations or conventional definitions of success. The absence of my parents and brother from our lives was now simply a fact rather than an ongoing source of pain or confusion. Months had passed since Trevor's attempt at mediation, and there had been no further contact from any member of my biological family. I occasionally saw social media updates indicating that they continued with their lives entirely unaffected by the estrangement. My mother posted photos from the coastal Maine vacation property they had apparently succeeded in purchasing, presumably having found the necessary funds from sources other than me. My father shared articles about financial planning strategies and market analysis. Trevor documented his professional achievements and expensive leisure activities. Their lives appeared comfortable and successful according to the metrics they valued, and they showed no indication that the absence of relationship with me or with their granddaughter created any void they felt compelled to address. I had reached a point of genuine indifference to their activities and choices. I no longer checked their social media profiles with the mixture of hurt and curiosity that had characterized my relationship with their public presentations earlier in my life. I no longer wondered whether they ever thought about Emma or regretted missing opportunities to know her. I had accepted that they were fundamentally different people than I had wished them to be, and that continuing to maintain any emotional investment in their potential transformation was pointless and self-destructive. This acceptance brought peace that I had not experienced during the years when I was still hoping for change or seeking their approval. Emma had largely stopped asking questions about my parents. She understood that she had grandparents on her father's side who loved her and were actively involved in her life, and she accepted without apparent distress that her maternal grandparents were distant figures who did not participate in her daily existence. Children are remarkably adaptable to whatever family structure they experience as normal, and for Emma, the presence of Daniel's parents as engaged grandparents and the absence of my parents as essentially non-existent figures was simply how her family was configured. She did not appear to feel any sense of loss about relationships she had never actually experienced. In December, approximately 14 months after Emma's surgery, my first novel received recognition that significantly expanded its reach and impact. The book was selected as a finalist for a prestigious literary award that generated substantial media attention and dramatically increased sales. Being named a finalist did not guarantee winning the award, but the recognition itself was meaningful and brought attention from readers, media outlets, and industry professionals who might not have otherwise encountered the book. The announcement of the finalists generated interview requests from book reviewers and literary podcasters who wanted to discuss my work and my writing process. I participated in these promotional activities enthusiastically, grateful for the opportunity to reach wider audiences and to discuss themes in the novel that mattered deeply to me. The increased visibility also generated additional interest in the second novel I was currently writing, with my publisher expressing greater confidence in its commercial prospects given the success of the first book. The literary award ceremony took place in January at a formal event in New York City. Daniel and I made arrangements for Emma to stay with his parents for the weekend and traveled to the city for the event. This was the first time we had been away from Emma overnight since her surgery, and despite knowing she was in excellent hands with grandparents who adored her, I felt anxious about being separated from her even briefly. The medical crisis had heightened my protective instincts in ways that I recognized were probably somewhat excessive, but that I could not entirely control. The award ceremony was an elegant event attended by authors, publishers, literary agents, and book industry professionals. I wore a dress I had purchased specifically for the occasion, one of the few times in my adult life I had invested in formal clothing. Sitting in the audience waiting for my category to be announced, I felt simultaneously excited about the possibility of winning and convinced that one of the other finalists, all of whom had more established careers and more prestigious publishing backgrounds, would ultimately receive the recognition. When my name was called as the winner, I experienced a moment of complete disbelief followed by overwhelming emotion. Daniel squeezed my hand as I stood and made my way to the stage to accept the award. The recognition validated years of work and sacrifice, countless hours spent writing during stolen moments while managing financial stress and family obligations. It confirmed that the choice I had made to pursue creative work over more conventional career paths had been correct despite all the criticism and doubt I had faced from my parents and from voices of practical caution in my own mind. I delivered a brief acceptance speech in which I thanked my agent and publisher, acknowledged my fellow finalists, and spoke about the importance of supporting artistic work, even when it does not conform to conventional definitions of professional success. I thanked Daniel for his unwavering support, and for believing in my work when circumstances made it difficult to maintain that belief. I did not mention my parents or the family estrangement that had shaped much of my adult experience, but the themes of the novel they were recognizing, themes of building chosen family and finding belonging outside of biological relationships, carried that story implicitly for anyone who understood the context. The award came with a monetary prize of $15,000, in addition to the recognition itself. The amount was symbolically significant given that $15,000 was exactly what my mother had demanded I lend her for the vacation home purchase, the request that had precipitated the final breakdown of our relationship. I had refused that request because we did not have the money and because even if we had possessed it, I would not have given it to people who had failed so completely to support us during Emma's medical crisis. Now I was receiving exactly that amount as recognition for creative work my parents had always dismissed as impractical and worthless. The irony was not lost on me, though I felt no desire to contact them to point it out. Their validation was no longer something I needed or wanted. The success of the first novel, and the literary award recognition created momentum that affected multiple aspects of my professional life. The film production company that had optioned the adaptation rights became more actively engaged in development, hiring a screenwriter, and moving the project forward with greater urgency, now that the source material had received prestigious recognition. My agent fielded increased interest from publishers about the second novel I was writing, with multiple editors expressing eagerness to see the manuscript when completed. I received invitations to speak at literary festivals and university writing programs about my work and my path to publication. This professional success was gratifying, but also somewhat surreal given how recently I had been working night shifts at a warehouse to afford community college tuition, and living in a basement apartment with questionable electrical systems. The contrast between those years of struggle and my current circumstances was stark. I had not become wealthy by any means. Writing literary fiction rarely generates the kind of income that allows for luxury lifestyles. But I had achieved professional recognition in the field I had chosen to pursue despite substantial opposition and discouragement, and I was earning enough from my creative work combined with strategic freelance projects to support my family without requiring Daniel to bear the entire financial burden of our household. More importantly than the external recognition or improved finances, I had proven to myself that persistence and refusal to compromise on deeply held values could actually lead to meaningful success. I had not needed to abandon my artistic aspirations to achieve financial stability. I had not needed to accept my parents' definition of what constituted worthwhile work. I had created a life that aligned with my values and that provided both material security and creative fulfillment, and I had done so despite rather than because of my family of origin's influence. Emma turned 6 years old in early spring, a birthday that carried profound significance as the 2-year anniversary of her brain tumor diagnosis and surgery. The surgeon's final follow-up appointment confirmed what we had observed through daily experience, that she had recovered completely with no residual effects and no indication of tumor recurrence. We were officially discharged from ongoing neurosurgical care, transitioning to routine annual check-ins, rather than the frequent monitoring appointments that had characterized the previous 2 years. The medical chapter of that crisis was definitively closed. We celebrated Emma's birthday with a party attended by her kindergarten friends, by Daniel's parents, and by several of our close friends who had supported us throughout the difficult period. The celebration was joyful and uncomplicated, focused entirely on Emma's happiness and on gratitude for her health and vitality. There was no acknowledgement of my parents' continued absence because their absence was now simply part of our family's normal reality, rather than an acute wound requiring attention. Daniel's mother pulled me aside during the party and told me how proud she was of everything I had accomplished in the past year, both professionally with the novel recognition and personally in how I had navigated difficult family dynamics, while remaining focused on what truly mattered. She told me that she and Daniel's father considered me their daughter in every meaningful sense, and that they were grateful Emma had a mother who was strong enough to make difficult choices to protect her family's well-being. Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. I had found in Daniel's parents the kind of unconditional acceptance and support I had always hoped to receive from my own parents, but that they had proven incapable of providing. The spring proceeded with continued forward momentum in multiple dimensions of our lives. I completed the first draft of my second novel in April, approximately 16 months after signing the contract, 2 months ahead of the deadline I had negotiated. The manuscript required significant revision and refinement, but the fundamental story was complete, and I was satisfied with its emotional core and thematic coherence. My agent and editor both responded enthusiastically to the draft, providing detailed feedback for revision, but expressing confidence that the book would be strong when polished. Daniel received recognition from his school district for excellence in educational leadership, an award that came with a modest salary bonus and an opportunity to participate in advanced professional development programs. His success in the department chair role had demonstrated that effective teaching and administrative leadership were not mutually exclusive, that someone could maintain focus on student learning and teacher support, while managing the practical and bureaucratic aspects of educational systems. Our financial situation had stabilized to a degree that would have seemed impossible during the years of struggle. We had eliminated all debt except our student loans, which we were paying down systematically on an income-based repayment plan. We maintained healthy emergency savings that provided genuine security against unexpected expenses. We were able to make modest contributions to retirement accounts, beginning to build long-term financial stability rather than merely surviving month to month. We had learned to live within our means while still allocating resources to things that genuinely enhanced our quality of life and aligned with our values. Most significantly, we had built a life characterized by purpose, genuine relationships, and alignment between our actions and our values. We were not wealthy by conventional measures. We did not own a home or take expensive vacations or accumulate luxury possessions. But we had work that mattered to us, relationships based on authentic care and reciprocated support, and the freedom to make choices based on what we believed was important, rather than on external pressure or inherited expectations. This represented a form of success that was more meaningful than any amount of money or professional status, achieved at the cost of compromising fundamental values. The story of my estrangement from my parents had reached its resolution not through dramatic reconciliation but through acceptance and the construction of a full life that did not require their participation. They had made their choices about what mattered to them, and I had made mine. The divergence between those choices had rendered any ongoing relationship impossible, but I had discovered that relationships forfeited because of fundamental value conflicts create space for relationships based on actual compatibility and mutual respect. I had lost the family I had been born into, but I had gained a family I had chosen and built, and that chosen family was infinitely more valuable than biological connection unsupported by genuine care. The summer following Emma's 6th birthday marked a period of consolidation and reflection, as I worked through revisions on my second novel, and considered the trajectory my life had taken over the previous 3 years. The transformation from the person I had been during Emma's medical crisis to the person I had become was profound in ways that extended far beyond professional achievement or financial stability. I had developed a clarity about what mattered and what did not that informed every decision I made and every relationship I chose to maintain or release. The revision process for the second novel required me to engage deeply with themes of family dysfunction, and the process of healing from childhood wounds inflicted by parents who were unable or unwilling to provide the support their children needed. Writing this material was emotionally challenging, because it required me to revisit experiences I had spent years trying to move beyond. But it was also cathartic in ways I had not anticipated, transforming my personal pain into fictional narrative that might resonate with readers experiencing similar struggles gave meaning to experiences that had once felt merely devastating. My editor provided extensive feedback on the manuscript that pushed me to deepen the emotional complexity of the characters and to avoid simplistic resolutions that would undermine the authenticity of the story. She challenged me to resist the temptation to provide easy answers or neat conclusions to questions about family estrangement and the possibility of reconciliation. Real life rarely offered such tidy resolutions, she reminded me, and fiction that claimed otherwise rang false to readers who had lived through similar experiences. I spent July and August working through multiple rounds of revision, refining the prose and strengthening the character development, while maintaining the emotional honesty that formed the core of the book. The work was demanding but satisfying in ways that reminded me why I had chosen writing as my vocation despite all the practical difficulties that choice entailed. Creating narrative that captured authentic human experience, and that might provide recognition or comfort to readers navigating similar challenges, felt like work that mattered in ways that transcended commercial success or professional recognition. Daniel had taken on a summer curriculum development project for his school district that provided additional income and allowed him to shape the literature selections and teaching approaches that would be used across multiple schools in the coming academic year. He approached this work with the same dedication and thoughtfulness he brought to his regular teaching, selecting texts that would challenge students intellectually while remaining accessible and engaging. His commitment to his profession and to his students' learning and growth remained absolute despite the modest compensation teaching provided compared to other careers requiring similar education levels and expertise. Emma attended a summer day camp program that focused on arts and outdoor activities. She had formed close friendships with several children from her kindergarten class, and these relationships were developing into the kind of childhood bonds that would likely extend for years. Watching her navigate social dynamics and develop her own personality independent of parental influence was both fascinating and occasionally challenging, as she asserted preferences and opinions that sometimes conflicted with what Daniel and I might have chosen for her. But her growing independence was healthy and appropriate, and we tried to honor her emerging autonomy while still providing the guidance and boundaries children need. In late August, I received communication from my literary agent that the film production company developing the adaptation of my first novel had successfully secured financing and was moving forward with production. The project had advanced beyond the option stage into actual filmmaking, which triggered additional payments outlined in our original agreement and meant that the adaptation would actually be created rather than remaining theoretical. The director they had hired was an independent filmmaker with several critically acclaimed projects in her portfolio, and the lead actress attached to the project was a respected performer known for choosing character-driven material rather than commercial blockbusters. This development represented validation of my work in a different medium and at a different scale than literary recognition had provided. Film adaptation would introduce the story to audiences who might never have encountered the book, and would create opportunities for broader cultural conversation about themes I cared deeply about exploring. It also generated additional income that further stabilized our financial situation and allowed us to begin considering possibilities we had previously dismissed as impractical or unattainable. One such possibility was purchasing a home rather than continuing to rent. We had been living in the same apartment for several years, and while it was adequate for our needs, we had begun to feel constrained by the limited space and by the restrictions inherent in rental situations. Owning property would provide stability and the freedom to modify our living space to better suit our family's needs. It would also represent a form of investment and wealth building that renting could never provide. Daniel and I spent several evenings that autumn researching the local real estate market and calculating what we could realistically afford given our income, existing student loan obligations, and desire to maintain healthy emergency savings. We discovered that homes in our immediate area were largely beyond our price range, but that smaller towns within reasonable commuting distance of Daniel's school and my network of freelance clients offered more affordable options. We began attending open houses and working with a real estate agent to identify properties that might meet our needs and budget. The process of house hunting required us to articulate clearly what we valued in a living situation and what compromises we were willing to make. We prioritized adequate space for Emma to have her own room and for me to have a dedicated workspace for writing. We wanted a safe neighborhood with good public schools. We preferred older homes with character over newer construction that felt generic and sterile. We were willing to accept properties that needed cosmetic updating or minor repairs in exchange for lower purchase prices that fit within our budget constraints. By October, we had identified a house that met our criteria. It was a modest 3-bedroom cottage built in the 1940s, located in a small town approximately 30 minutes from where we currently lived. The house needed significant cosmetic work including updated flooring, fresh paint throughout and kitchen renovations, but the fundamental structure was sound and the price was within our budget. The property included a detached garage that could potentially be converted into a dedicated writing studio, providing the kind of professional workspace I had never had, but that would significantly improve my productivity and work-life balance. We made an offer on the property that was accepted after brief negotiation. The closing process required several months of inspections, financing arrangements, and legal documentation. But by early December we had completed the purchase and taken ownership of our first home. The sense of accomplishment and security that came with homeownership was profound. This was property that belonged to us, that we could modify and improve according to our preferences, that would provide stability for Emma's remaining childhood years. It represented a form of success that was deeply meaningful precisely because we had achieved it entirely through our own efforts without assistance from family wealth or inherited advantages. We spent the winter months gradually renovating the house while still living in our apartment, doing as much of the work ourselves as our skills and time allowed while hiring professionals for tasks requiring specialized expertise. Daniel demonstrated unexpected competence with painting and basic carpentry. I researched design approaches and managed contractor relationships. Emma accompanied us on weekends to the new house and delighted in choosing paint colors for her future bedroom and imagining how the space would look when completed. The renovation process was exhausting and occasionally frustrating when projects took longer or cost more than we had anticipated. But it was also deeply satisfying to see the house transform gradually from a dated and slightly shabby property into a space that reflected our aesthetic preferences and functional needs. We installed new flooring throughout the main living areas. We painted every room in colors that made the small spaces feel brighter and more spacious. We updated light fixtures and hardware to create visual coherence. We planted gardens in the front and backyards that would bloom in the spring and provide Emma with outdoor space to play. By March, approximately 3 months after purchasing the property, we had completed enough renovation work to make the house livable and comfortable. We moved out of our apartment and into our new home on a cold but sunny weekend with assistance from Daniel's parents and several close friends. The process of unpacking and arranging our possessions in the new space created a sense of fresh beginning that felt appropriate, given how much our lives had changed over the previous few years. Emma adjusted to the new house quickly and enthusiastically. She loved having her own larger bedroom and the backyard space where she could play. The transition to a new school district in the middle of the academic year was more challenging, requiring her to leave friends she had made in kindergarten and to navigate the social dynamics of entering an established classroom community as a newcomer. But she demonstrated resilience and adaptability that reassured us we had made the right decision in prioritizing long-term stability over short-term continuity. The house also represented a visible manifestation of everything I had built without my parents' support or approval. They had consistently dismissed my career choices as impractical and had predicted I would struggle financially throughout my adult life because of my refusal to pursue more conventional and lucrative professions. Yet here I was, a homeowner at age 32, having achieved this milestone through income generated primarily by creative work they had characterized as worthless. I felt no desire to contact them to point out this accomplishment because their validation remained irrelevant to my sense of achievement. But I recognized privately the significance of having proven their predictions entirely wrong. My second novel was published in April, approximately 2 years after I had signed the contract to write it. The publication process was less stressful than it had been for my first book because I now understood what to expect, and because the success of the first novel had generated advance interest in the second that provided some confidence about its reception. Early reviews were positive, with critics praising the emotional authenticity and the nuanced exploration of family dysfunction and healing. Sales in the first month exceeded publisher expectations, suggesting the book would perform well commercially in addition to receiving critical recognition. The film adaptation of my first novel premiered at a major film festival that same month. Daniel and I traveled to the festival for the screening, leaving Emma with his parents for the extended weekend. Watching my story translated into visual medium was surreal and moving in ways I had not anticipated. The director had captured the emotional essence of the book, while making creative choices appropriate for film that differed from my original narrative approach. Seeing actors embody characters I had created and bringing them to life through performance gave the story a different kind of reality than it had possessed on the page. The film received positive responses from festival audiences and critics, which led to acquisition by a distribution company that would release it in theaters later that year. This meant wider exposure than many independent literary adaptations received, and increased the likelihood that the film would reach substantial audiences. It also meant additional income through theatrical distribution agreements and eventual streaming rights, further improving our financial situation and providing resources we could allocate toward Emma's future education expenses and our own long-term financial security. The professional success I had achieved by my early 30s would have seemed impossible to imagine during the years when I was working multiple jobs to afford community college tuition, or living in a basement apartment surviving on ramen noodles and peanut butter. The trajectory from those circumstances to my current situation had required unwavering commitment to my artistic vision, willingness to endure financial hardship and family rejection, and refusal to compromise on values that defined who I was and what I believed mattered. The success felt earned in ways that inherited wealth or conventional career achievement never could, because every element of it had been built through deliberate choice and persistent effort in the face of substantial obstacles. Daniel's career had also continued developing in satisfying directions. He had been promoted to assistant principal at his high school, a position that expanded his influence on school culture and educational policy, while maintaining his connection to classroom teaching through occasional courses he continued to lead. The administrative role came with meaningful salary increase that contributed significantly to our household financial stability and allowed us to accelerate student loan repayment and retirement savings contributions. His success reinforced our shared conviction that meaningful work and financial adequacy were not mutually exclusive, that people could pursue vocations aligned with their values while still achieving middle-class economic security. Emma completed first grade with strong academic performance and positive social adjustment to her new school environment. She had developed particular interests in reading and creative writing, spending substantial time creating her own stories and illustrations in notebooks she kept in her room. Watching her engage with storytelling and imagination reminded me of my own childhood experience of discovering writing as a way to make sense of the world, and to create spaces of beauty and meaning when actual circumstances felt limiting or painful. I hoped her experience would be different from mine, that she would grow up with encouragement and support for her creative interests, rather than dismissal and pressure to pursue more practical endeavors. As summer approached, Daniel and I reflected on how far we had come since the terrifying days of Emma's brain tumor diagnosis and surgery 3 years earlier. We had survived a medical crisis that could have ended tragically. We had navigated the final breakdown of my relationship with my parents and the grief and liberation that accompanied that loss. We had achieved professional success in our respective fields that validated our career choices and provided financial stability. We had purchased a home and created a living environment that reflected our values and supported our family's needs. We had built a life characterized by purpose, genuine relationships, and alignment between our stated values and our actual choices. The absence of my parents from this life remained a fact but no longer an active wound. Months passed without my thinking about them at all, except in occasional moments when something would trigger memory of my childhood or adolescence. I did not miss them in any meaningful sense because the relationship we had maintained before the final estrangement had never provided the kind of connection or support that creates genuine attachment. I had grieved the parents I wished I had rather than the parents I actually had, and that grief had resolved into acceptance and indifference. Emma had essentially no relationship with or awareness of my parents at this point. She knew abstractly that she had maternal grandparents who existed somewhere, but who were not part of her life. But this knowledge held no emotional charge for her because she had never experienced anything different. She had grandparents and Daniel's parents who loved her actively and visibly, who attended her school events and birthday celebrations, who called regularly and visited frequently. That was her experience of grandparental relationships, and the absence of my parents created no void in her life because they had never occupied space there to begin with. This summer I began preliminary work on a third novel, though I had not yet signed a contract or committed to a specific timeline for completion. The writing felt less pressured than previous projects because our financial situation no longer required me to produce publishable work on demanding schedules to generate necessary income. I could approach the creative process with greater freedom and patience, allowing ideas to develop fully before committing to particular narrative directions. This freedom was itself a form of success, the ability to engage with creative work for its own sake rather than primarily as income generation. Daniel and I also began discussing the possibility of expanding our family. Emma was now 7 years old and had been asking occasionally about the possibility of siblings, We had always imagined having multiple children but had deferred that decision during the years of financial stress and medical crisis. Now, with greater stability and security, the question felt worth reconsidering. We were both aware that adding another child would create new challenges and constraints, but we were also confident that we had built a family structure and support system capable of managing those challenges, while maintaining our commitments to meaningful work and to each other. The life we had created was not perfect or without ongoing difficulties. Financial constraints remained real despite significant improvement in our circumstances. Professional demands created time pressures that sometimes left us exhausted. Parenting required constant attention and adaptation as Emma grew and changed. But the difficulties we faced felt manageable and worthwhile, because they existed within the context of a life we had chosen deliberately, and that reflected our authentic values and priorities. I had learned through difficult experience that success is not primarily about wealth or status or conventional markers of achievement. Success is about building a life that aligns with who you actually are rather than who others believe you should be. It is about forming relationships based on genuine care and reciprocated support, rather than obligation or biological accident. It is about doing work that feels meaningful even when it does not generate maximum income. It is about making choices that honor your values, even when those choices create hardship or require sacrifice. By these measures, I had succeeded more completely than I had dared hope during the years when I was struggling to survive financially and emotionally while pursuing dreams that everyone around me dismissed as impractical. I had proven that artistic work could provide both creative fulfillment and adequate income. I had demonstrated that family could be chosen and built rather than merely inherited. I had shown that refusing to compromise fundamental values was not naive idealism, but rather the foundation for building an authentic and sustainable life. The journey from the frightened young woman who had been rejected by her parents for choosing creative work over conventional careers to the person I had become had been difficult and painful in ways that had sometimes felt unbearable. But that journey had also been necessary and ultimately worthwhile. The struggles had taught me resilience and clarity. The losses had created space for relationships and opportunities that never would have developed if I had maintained connections with people who diminished rather than supported me. The hardships had forged strength I would never have developed through easier circumstances. As I sat in the backyard of our home on a warm June evening, watching Emma play and listening to Daniel preparing dinner in the kitchen, I felt a contentment that was deeper and more stable than happiness dependent on external circumstances. This was the life I had built through deliberate choices made consistently over many years. This was the family I had created through commitment and mutual support. This was the success that mattered not because anyone else recognized or validated it, but because it was real and authentic and aligned with everything I believed about what made life meaningful. The autumn following Emma's 7th birthday brought an unexpected disruption to the peaceful equilibrium our lives had achieved. I had spent the summer working on preliminary drafts of my third novel, while managing ongoing promotional activities for the second book and supporting the theatrical release of the film adaptation. The film had performed reasonably well in limited release, generating positive reviews and modest box office returns that exceeded expectations for an independent literary adaptation. The attention to my work across multiple formats had elevated my profile within literary and cultural circles in ways that created new opportunities while also attracting unwanted scrutiny. In late September, I received an email from a journalist who was writing a feature article about authors whose work explored themes of family estrangement and chosen family structures. She had read both of my novels and had seen the film adaptation, and she was interested in interviewing me about how my personal experiences informed my creative work. The request was professionally framed and came from a reputable publication, so I agreed to participate in what I understood would be a thoughtful exploration of how writers transform personal material into fiction. The interview took place via video call and lasted approximately 90 minutes. The journalist asked intelligent questions about my writing process, about the themes that recurred in my work, and about how I navigated the ethical complexities of drawing from personal experience while respecting the privacy of real people who might recognize themselves in fictional characters. I answered honestly but carefully, discussing the emotional truths I was exploring without providing specific details about my actual family circumstances or naming real individuals who had inspired fictional characters. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked directly whether I was estranged from my own parents, and whether that estrangement had informed the family dynamics portrayed in my novels. I hesitated before responding because I had not anticipated such a direct personal question, and had not decided in advance how I would address it if asked. After considering briefly, I confirmed that I did not have a relationship with my parents but declined to provide details about the circumstances that had led to that estrangement, explaining that those were private family matters I did not wish to discuss publicly. The article was published 3 weeks later in both print and online formats. The piece was well written and thoughtful in its analysis of how contemporary authors were exploring changing definitions of family and belonging in their work. However, the article also included several paragraphs about my personal estrangement from my parents, framing it as context for understanding the emotional authenticity of my fictional narratives. While the journalist had not included any information I had not voluntarily provided, seeing my family circumstances described in a national publication felt invasive and uncomfortable in ways I had not fully anticipated when I agreed to the interview. The article generated significant online discussion, with readers sharing their own experiences of family estrangement and debating the ethics of parents who failed to support their children's choices and dreams. Some readers expressed sympathy for my situation while others questioned whether I might be misrepresenting family dynamics or failing to acknowledge my own role in relationship breakdowns. The public nature of this discussion felt strange and unsettling. Strangers were forming opinions about my family and my choices based on limited information filtered through journalistic framing and their own projective assumptions. More significantly, the article apparently came to the attention of my parents and brother, presumably through mutual acquaintances or through their own online searching. 2 days after the article's publication, I received an email from my brother Trevor. The message was brief and angry in tone. He wrote that I had publicly humiliated our family by discussing private matters with journalists, that I had misrepresented circumstances to portray myself as a victim and our parents as villains, and that my actions were causing our parents emotional distress and damaging their reputations within their professional and social communities. Trevor demanded that I contact the publication and request a retraction or correction, insisting that I had an obligation to protect our family's privacy and dignity. He suggested that my willingness to discuss our estrangement publicly demonstrated selfishness and vindictiveness, that I was exploiting family difficulties for professional gain and public sympathy. He concluded by stating that my behavior had confirmed their decision to maintain distance from me, and that they wanted no further contact unless I was prepared to acknowledge the harm I had caused and to make appropriate amends. Reading Trevor's email triggered a complex mixture of emotions. I felt angry that he was characterizing my honest discussion of my experience as exploitation or misrepresentation. I felt frustrated that he seemed incapable of recognizing that I had every right to tell my own story, and to discuss how family rejection had shaped my life and work. But I also felt a resurgence of old pain associated with their complete inability to understand my perspective, or to acknowledge their own role in creating the estrangement they now claim to be victims of. I did not respond to Trevor's email. Engaging with his accusations and demands would have required me to justify choices and actions that I knew were entirely appropriate, and that did not require his approval or understanding. I had learned through difficult experience that attempting to explain myself to people who were determined to misunderstand me was futile and emotionally exhausting. Instead, I saved the email for documentation purposes, and then deleted it from my primary inbox to avoid the temptation to reread it and become further upset. Daniel's response when I showed him the email was immediate and supportive. He characterized Trevor's message as manipulative and absurd, pointing out that I had not named my family members in the interview or provided identifying details beyond acknowledging the existence of an estrangement. The journalist had written about themes in my fiction, and had included minimal biographical context that I had voluntarily provided. There was nothing inappropriate or actionable about my participation in the interview, and I had no obligation to protect the feelings of people who had consistently failed to protect mine. His clear-eyed assessment helped restore my equilibrium and reminded me that I had made the right choices in limiting my family's access to my life. People who would respond to my professional success and public recognition by demanding I silence myself to protect their comfort were precisely the kind of people I needed to maintain firm boundaries with. Their reaction confirmed rather than challenged the wisdom of the estrangement. The incident did cause me to reflect more carefully on how I discuss personal matters in professional contexts. I decided that moving forward I would decline to participate in interviews that focused primarily on biographical details, rather than on my work itself. I would maintain firmer boundaries between my public professional identity and my private personal circumstances. While I had no regret about acknowledging the estrangement when directly asked, I recognized that public discussion of family matters, even in limited and carefully framed ways, could create complications and unwanted attention that served no useful purpose. The controversy generated by the article faded quickly from public attention as new cultural conversations emerged and replaced it in the rapid cycle of online discourse. Within 2 weeks, the discussion had essentially ended and my life returned to its normal patterns. I heard nothing further from my family following Trevor's initial angry email, and I made no attempt to contact them. The incident had been unpleasant but ultimately inconsequential beyond reinforcing lessons I had already learned about maintaining appropriate boundaries and about the futility of seeking understanding from people fundamentally opposed to providing it. Emma's second grade year was progressing smoothly. She had fully adjusted to her school and had developed a close group of friends with whom she spent time both during school hours and through playdates and activities we arranged outside of school. Her academic performance remained strong, and her teachers reported that she was engaged, curious, and kind in her interactions with both adults and peers. The qualities Daniel and I had tried to model and encourage were becoming visible in how she navigated her world, and watching her develop into a thoughtful and compassionate person provided satisfaction that transcended any professional achievement. We had also decided to proceed with expanding our family. After extensive discussion about timing and logistics, we felt confident that we had the emotional and financial resources to manage the demands of a second child. I became pregnant in October, with a due date in early summer. The pregnancy was planned and welcomed, though it brought practical considerations about how I would manage my writing schedule and professional commitments during the later stages of pregnancy and the early months of caring for a newborn, while also parenting an active 7-year-old. The pregnancy announcement generated warm responses from friends and from Daniel's parents, who were thrilled about the prospect of a second grandchild. We told Emma about the coming baby in terms she could understand, and she expressed excitement about becoming a big sister, though we knew that the reality of sharing parental attention might be more challenging than the abstract anticipation. We began preparing practically for the addition to our family, identifying how we would reconfigure bedrooms and planning for the financial implications of childcare and other child-related expenses. My professional work continued to demand significant time and energy even as pregnancy fatigue and physical discomfort began affecting my productivity. The film adaptation of my first novel had completed its theatrical run and was moving into the streaming release phase, which required participating in additional promotional interviews and online discussions. My second novel had been optioned for adaptation as a limited television series, a development that required negotiations about creative control and adaptation rights. I was also working steadily on the third novel, trying to complete a substantial draft before the pregnancy advanced to the point where sustained concentration became difficult. Daniel had taken on additional responsibilities at his school beyond his assistant principal role, including leading a district-wide initiative to improve literacy instruction across all grade levels. The work was meaningful and aligned with his core professional values, but it was also time-consuming and occasionally stressful, as he navigated the political complexities of educational bureaucracy and stakeholder management. We were both working at capacity, managing our professional obligations while also attending to Emma's needs and preparing for the significant life change that a new baby would represent. In December, my second novel received recognition similar to what the first book had achieved, being named a finalist for the same prestigious literary award I had won 2 years earlier. While I did not ultimately win on this occasion, being recognized as a finalist for a second consecutive book confirmed that my success was not a singular achievement, but rather represented a sustained level of quality and impact. The recognition generated renewed media attention and increased sales, and it positioned me more firmly as an established voice in contemporary literary fiction, rather than as someone who had produced one successful book and might or might not be able to replicate that success. The winter months were characterized by sustained productivity and forward momentum despite the physical challenges of pregnancy and the demanding schedules both Daniel and I were maintaining. I completed a full draft of my third novel in February, approximately 4 months before my due date. The manuscript required extensive revision, but having the fundamental narrative completed before the baby arrived felt like a significant accomplishment that would prevent the kind of deadline pressure and stress that would be impossible to manage with a newborn. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.